Taiwan's legislature just cut a major chunk of its own defense budget, not because the threat disappeared. Chinese military aircraft are still circling the island, naval vessels are still operating in the strait, and Donald Trump is on his way to Beijing. So why, right now, of all moments, did Taiwan's opposition vote to slash funding for the very weapon system military analysts say Beijing fears most? That question has rattled Taipei, alarmed Washington, and handed Beijing something it has wanted for years: a visible crack in Taiwan's political armor, displayed to the world on the eve of a summit that could reshape the entire Taiwan Strait. Today is May 10th, 2026, and in Taipei, something unusual happened, something that set off alarm bells in Washington and likely caused quiet satisfaction in Beijing. Taiwan's opposition-controlled legislature passed a defense budget, but not the one President Lai Ching-te asked for. His original proposal? Roughly $40 billion to build up Taiwan's military capacity against a potential Chinese attack. What the legislature approved? A package cut by about a third, with specific funding stripped from Taiwan's growing domestic drone industry. The woman at the center of this moment is Li-wun. She chairs the Kuomintang, the KMT, Taiwan's largest opposition party and one of Asia's oldest political organizations. Just weeks ago, she was in Beijing, sitting face-to-face with Xi Jinping in a meeting that hadn't happened at that level in a decade. Now she's in Taipei, telling CNN that weapons are not Taiwan's answer. And in days, Donald Trump will be sitting in that same city, Beijing, meeting that same man. If you want fast, fact-based coverage on a story that is moving this quickly, subscribe now. We're tracking every development as it unfolds. Let's build the full picture. The KMT's Li-wun did not arrive at this moment quietly. Her road here is one of the more improbable political journeys in modern Taiwan. She was once a student activist, fiery, confrontational. She openly condemned the KMT as tyrannical and supported Taiwan independence. That was the person she used to be. Today, she heads the KMT, and last month, she traveled to Beijing for a meeting with Xi Jinping, the first high-level contact between China's Communist Party and Taiwan's main opposition in a decade. She stood in the Great Hall of the People, shook Xi's hand, and came back to Taipei with a message: dialogue, not defense, is Taiwan's path forward. This week, she sat down with CNN just steps from the towering bronze statue of Chiang Kai-shek, the former KMT leader whose defeat in the Chinese Civil War 8 decades ago sent him retreating to Taiwan with what remained of his government. That retreat is why the Taiwan Strait dispute exists at all. The statue loomed behind the interview like a historical reminder that these tensions didn't begin yesterday. Chiang's core argument is straightforward and deeply contested. She believes Taiwan does not need to choose between Washington and Beijing, that being close to America does not require hostility toward China, and that military buildup without dialogue is a path toward the kind of catastrophe she has described in stark terms. Taiwan does not want to become the next Ukraine, she said directly to CNN. That line was not accidental. It was aimed at a specific fear: that Taiwan could find itself in an active war, armed by outside powers, fighting on its own territory. The same day that interview aired, Taiwan's legislature acted. The defense package that President Lai had designed, $40 billion, covering U.S. arms purchases, domestic military production, and crucially, an expanding drone program, was passed in a significantly reduced form. The approved budget preserves the U.S. arms deals, but it cuts into domestic defense development. The drone funding in particular took a hit. That detail matters. Matt Pottinger, a senior U.S. national security official during Trump's first term, published a commentary this week calling on Taiwan's opposition to, in his words, seriously reflect on why it is cutting drone funding. He described drones as cheap and effective capabilities that superpowers struggle to defend against. That is not mild language from a former White House official. It signals genuine concern in Washington that Taiwan's political divisions are producing real military vulnerabilities. Chiang pushed back. She told CNN the original budget contained vague allocations and that it would have been irresponsible to approve the full package without scrutiny. It is impossible for us to just blankly authorize the entire package, she said. But the timing. That is what nobody can fully explain away. The legislature votes to cut defense spending, and within days, the U.S. president will be sitting across from Xi Jinping in Beijing, where Taiwan will almost certainly come up. Here's the part that gets overlooked in the headlines. Even as Li-wun was meeting Xi Jinping in Beijing last month, in what was framed as a goodwill visit, Chinese military aircraft and naval vessels were simultaneously continuing their operations around Taiwan. The dialogue was happening. The military pressure didn't pause for it. To understand what is happening right now, you need to understand what Taiwan represents in the global strategic equation, and why almost everything about this story hits at the fault lines of that equation simultaneously. Taiwan is not just an island of 23 million people. It produces the majority of the world's most advanced semiconductors, the chips that power smartphones, AI systems, military hardware, and nearly every piece of modern technology on Earth. A disruption to Taiwan through conflict, blockade, or political instability would send shockwaves through the global economy that would dwarf the supply chain crises of recent years. Beijing has never relinquished its claim to Taiwan. It regards the island as Chinese territory, temporarily separated, ultimately to be reunified by force if necessary. The U.S. has for decades maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity, not formally committing to defend Taiwan militarily, but supplying weapons and maintaining a deterrent posture. Under that framework, Taiwan has built one of the most capable regional militaries relative to its size. But deterrence depends on credibility, and credibility requires two things: military capability and political unity. Right now, there are serious questions about both. The defense budget cut sends a signal, whether intended or not, that Taiwan's political class is divided on the urgency of the threat. That is precisely the signal Beijing has sought to project for years. Taiwanese security officials, according to CNN's reporting, have privately warned that Beijing is using Chang's outreach to portray Taiwan as politically divided and less aligned with Washington ahead of the Trump-Xi summit. That is a significant charge. It does not mean Chang is acting in bad faith, but it means the consequences of her political position extend well beyond domestic Taiwanese politics. And there is a deeper contradiction here worth sitting with for a moment. The Trump administration has been pressuring allies across Asia, not just Taiwan, to spend more on their own defense, to reduce America's burden. Taiwan's governing party attempted to answer that call with a $40 billion package. Its largest opposition party responded by cutting it down. Do you think this situation reaches a breaking point before the Trump-Xi summit concludes, or does the diplomacy hold? Let me know in the comments. What you think genuinely shapes how we cover the follow-up. The economic dimension runs even deeper. The arms purchases preserved in the approved budget still represent significant U.S. defense contracts. But the cuts to domestic production, the drones, the local industry, affect Taiwan's long-term ability to sustain its own defense without permanent dependence on U.S. supply chains. In a blockade scenario, that distinction becomes critical. And the alliance dynamics are complicated further by something Chang said that drew particular criticism. In her public statements, she has warned against external interference in the Taiwan Strait. That phrase, in the context of the Strait, is typically read as criticism of the United States and Japan, the two powers most visibly committed to Taiwan's security. Critics in Taipei have called it a replay of Beijing's own language, delivered by a Taiwanese politician. Chang rejects that framing. She argues she is pursuing peace, not alignment with Beijing. But words in this situation carry weight, and those particular words at this particular moment carried all the way to Washington. There is something in Chang Li-wun's personal story that changes the texture of everything she is doing now. She was not born into the KMT establishment. She fought against it. As a student activist, she condemned the KMT's authoritarianism, demanded democratic reform, supported Taiwan independence. She was, in many ways, everything the KMT once opposed. And now, she heads that party, and she sat across from Xi Jinping. And she came back embracing the One China framework, the political foundation that Beijing insists must underpin any cross-strait dialogue, and that many in Taiwan regard as a direct threat to their democratic identity. How does a former independence activist arrive at that position? That question doesn't have an easy answer. And it is one that many in Taiwan are asking with genuine urgency, because the answer shapes everything about how to interpret what she is doing. For the 23 million people who live on Taiwan, the questions being debated in legislative chambers and diplomatic summits are not abstract. They are the background noise of daily life, sometimes quiet, sometimes deafening. There is a generation of Taiwanese who grew up with the strait as simply a fact of geography. The threat of Chinese military force has been a constant in their lifetimes. They have learned to live with it, the way people in other places learn to live with earthquakes, aware of the danger, unable to fully predict it, building their lives in its shadow anyway. But something has shifted in recent years. The sight of what happened in Ukraine, a democratic country invaded, its cities damaged, its people displaced, its future altered by a neighbor that insisted it had historical claims to its territory, landed differently in Taiwan than it did almost anywhere else. The parallel was not lost on anyone. Ukraine did not choose conflict. Conflict chose Ukraine. Taiwan does not want to become the next Ukraine. Li-wun said those words to CNN this week. The phrase is carefully chosen, but it resonates differently depending on where you stand politically on the island. For those who agree with her, the lesson of Ukraine is that diplomacy must be pursued, that the cost of war is too enormous, that no arms package can protect a society from the destruction of open conflict. They watch the defense budget debate and see a government reaching for a military solution to a problem that requires political solutions. For those who oppose her view, the lesson of Ukraine is the opposite. They see a country that tried to negotiate, that held back from full military preparedness, and that found itself on the receiving end of force regardless. They look at Beijing's military activity around Taiwan, the aircraft, the naval vessels, the persistent pressure, and they do not see a partner ready for genuine dialogue. They see a strategy. Both interpretations are held by real people in Taiwan, people who share the same streets and the same future, and who disagree, sometimes bitterly, about how to protect it. The drone debate sits exactly at this fault line. Drones are not glamorous military hardware. They are not the fighter jets or submarines that dominate defense headlines. They are relatively inexpensive. They are produced domestically. They can be manufactured in volume. And they are, as the former U.S. national security official noted this week, something that even major military powers struggle to defend against effectively. For Taiwan, an island with limited strategic depth, a large drone capability represents something specific: the ability to impose a serious cost on any force that tries to cross the strait, without requiring the kind of expensive, U.S.-dependent weapon systems that might not arrive in time. Cutting that program at this moment is not just a budget decision. It is a signal about what kind of defense Taiwan is preparing for and who Taiwan believes will ultimately determine its fate. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the preparations for the Trump-Xi summit are underway. The agenda will be broad: trade, technology, military communication, fentanyl, North Korea, and Taiwan. Taiwan is always on that agenda. But this time, the political context is different. This time, a Taiwanese opposition leader met Xi just weeks before Trump arrived. This time, Taiwan's legislature voted to reduce its own defense investment in the same news cycle as the summit preparations. Beijing did not need to manufacture the appearance of Taiwanese division. It was visible. Taiwanese security officials are aware of this. According to CNN's reporting, they have privately expressed concern about the way this sequence of events, Cheng's Beijing visit, the budget cuts, the timing relative to the summit, creates a narrative that Beijing can use. Not because Cheng is working for Beijing, but because politics, even well-intentioned politics, produces consequences that extend beyond its intentions. In Taipei's cafes and offices and apartment buildings, people are watching. Some are relieved that someone is at least trying to talk. Others are afraid that the talking is happening at the wrong time, in the wrong way, with the wrong signals being sent to the wrong audience. And somewhere in all of that, 23 million people are doing what people everywhere do when large forces beyond their control are in motion. Hoping the decisions being made by powerful figures in distant rooms are the right ones. Trump and Xi will meet in Beijing within days. Taiwan will be on the table. It is always on the table. But this time, the political prelude has been unusually public. A Taiwanese opposition leader in Beijing, a defense budget slashed, a former U.S. official demanding answers about drone funding, and Taiwan's own security officials warning quietly that the optics are being exploited. What comes out of that summit, any commitments made, any language used, any signals sent about Taiwan's future will land on an island that is already politically divided about which direction leads to safety. If the summit produces a calmer tone between Washington and Beijing, Chang's approach will look prescient. If it produces new pressures on Taiwan, demands for neutrality, reduced U.S. arms sales, constraints on Taipei's foreign policy, the people who warned about this moment will be pointing to these weeks as the turning point they saw coming. Step back from the immediate news cycle for a moment and look at what is actually happening here. 3 separate significant events converged in a single week. A Taiwanese opposition leader, fresh from Beijing, publicly argued against her own government's defense policy. Taiwan's legislature voted to cut that defense budget, and the U.S. president prepared to meet the Chinese leader who has vowed unambiguously to achieve reunification with Taiwan. That convergence is not coincidence. Each of these events is connected to the others. They form a single story about Taiwan's political identity, its relationship with both superpowers, and the question of who ultimately gets to decide its future. Li-wun believes the answer to that question must involve Taiwan talking directly to Beijing, not simply buying more weapons and waiting for a crisis. She is betting, in effect, that engagement lowers the temperature enough to prevent the catastrophe everyone claims to want to avoid. Her critics believe that engagement at this moment, in this form, sends precisely the wrong message. That Beijing does not reduce pressure in response to political overtures from Taiwan. It increases leverage. They point to the military activity that continued even during Chang's goodwill visit to Beijing. The aircraft didn't stop. The naval patrols didn't pause. What intelligence agencies in Washington, Tokyo, and Taipei are monitoring right now is not just the summit agenda. They are watching how Beijing interprets this moment. Whether the combination of a divided Taiwan and a transactional U.S. administration creates an opening that Beijing feels it can exploit, not necessarily through military force, but through sustained political and economic pressure designed to bring Taiwan's governing party to the negotiating table on Beijing's terms. That is the scenario that keeps analysts up at night. Not necessarily a dramatic military event, a slow, quiet shift in Taiwan's political options, foreclosed one by one through a combination of external pressure and internal division, until the range of choices available to the island's democratic government has narrowed to something that looks less like sovereignty and more like managed dependency. Chang herself in the interview left no ambiguity about her ambitions. She is positioning the KMT to win local elections this year and take back the presidency in 2028. I think in the next 2 to 3 years, she told CNN, the fate of Taiwan is going to be a very determining moment. That is an unusual thing for a political leader to say out loud. It is an acknowledgement that the decisions being made right now in legislatures, in summits, in opposition party headquarters carry consequences that will not fully reveal themselves for years. The next few days will tell us something important about where the Trump administration places Taiwan in its broader negotiation with Beijing. Not through any formal declaration, through tone, through what is said, through what is not said, through which priorities get traded and which get protected. 23 million people on an island in the Pacific are going to be watching very carefully. This story does not end with the summit. Whatever comes out of Beijing in the next few days is the beginning of the next chapter, not the conclusion of this one. The defense budget, Chang's political trajectory, Taiwan's domestic divisions, and whatever Trump and Xi agree to or signal, all of it feeds into what happens in Taiwan's elections this year and its presidential race in 2028. The thread runs directly from today's headlines to a future that is genuinely uncertain. What do you think? Is Li-wun opening a door that needs to be opened, or walking into a trap that Beijing set deliberately? Is the defense cut a legitimate policy judgment or a strategic mistake at the worst possible time? Tell me in the comments. There is no obvious answer here, and I want to hear where you come down. Subscribe for every major update as this story develops. The next development could come from Beijing, from Taipei, or from Washington, and when it does, we will be covering it in full.